Welcome, welcome everybody. Welcome colleagues and friends and visitors to the final panel of our 60th anniversary celebration symposium. I am Michael Szonyi, the director of the Fairbank Center, though having made probably 6 or 8 times remarks, presumably you all know that by now. Welcome. What a tremendous intellectual feast we've had over the last couple of days. It's certainly exceeded my expectation in so many ways. I've been scribbling notes and I've learned so much. One of the things that has really struck me, we had sort of, in addition, as we were planning the symposium, in addition to identifying different subject areas, we had a kind of secret agenda that we hoped that different panels would address different questions as to the future of the Fairbank Center. So, for example, the U.S.-China-Taiwan panel, we hoped would speak about increasing complexity in the subject that we study, and it surely did. But one of the things that has really struck me is the way that different questions that we thought would be addressed in one panel were actually addressed in more than one. So, for example, we had thought that the panel on global health, organized by Arthur Kleinman, would be the moment when we talked about bringing different disciplines together. But it turned out that the same issue arose in the environment panel that just concluded. We thought that the environment panel might involve rethinking the relationship between China studies, area studies, global studies, and it turned out that many of our panels actually explored those kinds of issues. So for me, it's been an enormously successful symposium, and for that I am grateful to all of our panelists, to the tremendous staff at the Fairbank Center who have just worked tirelessly to make this happen, and also to you. So thank you very much. I thought in this last panel we would take a different tack on the challenges of the present and future of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. I'm a historian, so it's perhaps natural that that different tack was to think about how to bring the wisdom of the past to bear on the present and the future. The charge I gave to my distinguished colleagues was to reflect on the Fairbank Center's history in the hope of informing to reflect on where the Fairbank Center has been in the hope of informing where it should go, how the field of China studies is unfolding, and what we ought to do to maintain our leadership in the field. The Center of East Asian Research, as it was originally known, the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, as it is now known, has had 14 directors. 3 of them have passed away. John King Fairbank, who served as director of the center from its foundation until 1973, a span of almost 20 years, Benjamin Schwartz and Philip Kuhn. I have been sent regrets by a number of other former directors who were unable to be here today. Woody Watson, Marty White, Bill Kirby, who you did get a chance to hear from yesterday, and Liz Perry, who is overseas on university business. We do have, though, representation from, depending on how you count, 5 of the 6 decades of the Fairbank Center's existence. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers now and then ask them to give their remarks. In order of first service as director of the center. I had originally meant to say just service in their order of service as director, but 3 of our participants have actually served as director twice, now that I think about it. So they will speak in order of their first service as director. This is one of those panels where if I tell you all they've written, we'll have to move right on to Q&A. So I will select 1 or 2 of their exemplary works only. Ezra Vogel served as director from 1973 to 1975 and 1995 to 1999. He is the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences Emeritus at Harvard, and of course, the author of many works, the best known, perhaps, his biography of Deng Xiaoping. Roderick MacFarquhar served as director from 1986 to 1992, and then again from 2005 to 2006. He is the Leroy B. Williams Research Professor of History and Political Science, Emeritus, and the author of such works as The Origins of the Cultural Revolution. Wilt Idema served as director from 2002 to 2005. You were the director, Wilt, when I arrived at Harvard, so you were my first introduction to the Fairbank Center. Professor of Chinese Literature Emeritus. Professor Idema wins the prize for most evocative titles among center directors. His most recent work is The Resurrected Skeleton, and other works include Meng Jiangyu Brings Down the Wall. Finally, Mark Elliott, my predecessor, served as center director in 2010, and then again from 2012 to 2015. He is the Mark Schwartz Professor of Chinese and Inter-Asian History, and also, of course, Vice Provost for International Relations. So as I said, we have 4 of the 6 decades of leadership of the Fairbank Center represented here. I hope that we will learn from your experiences, and I in particular will learn where we might go. Bill Kirby, in his remarks yesterday, mentioned that on one standard, the real question as we enter our 60th year is our ear attuned? Which is what Confucius said when he turned 60. Ezra, at 40, did we have no delusions? Rod, at 60, did we know the mandate of heaven? With your help, our agenda for today is to set us up so that at 70, the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies will be able to follow our heart's desire without overstepping the boundaries of right. Ezra.
I'm so happy that Mike has organized this, which is a tremendous outpouring, which shows how much the Fairbank Center still means to all of us, and shows that it has a great future for the next 60 years. I first worked in the Fairbank Center in 1961, in the year 5 of the Fairbank Center. I was here as a graduate student in sociology, social relations. At the time it was founded, and I knew about its founding. But in the year 1961, I had the privilege of being one of the 4 associates of the center. The others were David Roy, whose younger brother, Stapleton Roy, turned out to be ambassador. David, who did that magnificent translation of Jinping Mei, unfortunately just passed away, was a brilliant Society of Fellows member. Hal Kahn, who went on to Stanford, and Mark Mankall, who left the field. We were the associates in those days. In 1967, when Lindbeck accepted the appointment to be head of the East Asian Institute in Columbia University, I became the associate director. So I worked for 5 years under Fairbank as the associate director. Then next few years, I became director, and then after I served in government a couple years in Washington, 93, 95, I came back and served again for several years. And I still now volunteered to run a symposium every week, the critical issues confronting China, because I thought that we still needed to work on building a community of people sitting around ideas the way we had in the early days. Let me say a few words, start off with John Fairbank and the vision that he had and how the Fairbank Center fit in, and then what we've tried to do, at least in the years that I've been associated with. Fairbank was a grand builder. I think that probably when he was in Oxford and decided to work on China, he already was thinking of what he would do when he came back to Harvard. And certainly in his many years in China, he had a chance to think about what he would do when he came to the center. And then he also worked several years in the U.S. Embassy in Chongqing during the war. So he had had experience in large organization, And he had thought about how the emperor did things. And as a historian, he particularly thought about notes and about history. One of the things that gave me, I think, greatest insight into Fairbank, when I was associate director for 5 years, he set a rule that all mail that he wrote, I would get a carbon copy, and any mail that I wrote, he would get a carbon copy. This was, of course, in the days before email, so that he knew everything I was saying to anybody, and I knew everything that he was saying to everybody. And what struck me about the memos is not only did he have a sense of humor, but he also had a sense of historical perspective. And as somebody who spent a lot of time reading the historical record, I'm sure he thought how his letters would be seen 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now. Because he had read so many documents that came from earlier years, which gave it a kind of a touch of grandeur. Now, what Fairbank was trying to do, I think, at Harvard, was set China on the mainstream. But I remember talking to one of the faculty who left earlier, who taught in East Asian languages. Says, you know, in the 30s, all of us who taught here, this is Hightower who told me this. He said we were all a bunch of oddballs, but Fairbank, wanted to put Chinese studies on the mainstream. It was not going to be a little ghetto, people doing obscure languages. It was going to be in the history department. And his vision for what we should do later in departments was get in the mainstream departments and get a China specialist in all the mainstream departments, get basic courses for the core curriculum, and do research that will put it on the map as something. And the people who had talked about world history as if it were just European history and American history would now have to stretch out and think of world history as including China, that great civilization, and he would play a role. And I remember Henry Rusovsky, who was dean for many years, said that of all the faculty, perhaps no faculty that he knew of at Harvard had done more to try to think of comprehensively what the field ought to do at Harvard in order to develop a field. He had his own basic rice paddies course. He had a research center. He had a training program for the MA to get people up to working at the Fairbank Center. Now, how did the Fairbank Center fit into this grand scheme of getting China in the mainstream? It was meant for research. And I think the story is that it was begun because Harvard Yenching had some lawyers who looked into their record, which showed that they could not do research. Harvard Yenching had gotten a lot of money from the aluminum man who invented Charles Martin Hall after World War I. And some people thought maybe they could do research as well as teach language and have a library. But lawyers said no. And at that point, Fairbank said, well, we need a research center. And at that time, there were 3 area centers at Harvard. President Pusey thought that Harvard could not afford to have area centers for all over the world. And when Galbraith came back as ambassador from India, Pusey and said, we need an India center. Pusey said, we don't have all the resources you need for a really big area center. You need a library, you need language, you need people in social science, you need history. It's a major investment. And at that time, there were only 3 centers at Harvard when Fairbank Center went up. The Russia, the Middle East, and East Asia. Now, what was the purpose of East Asia research? I could go into a lot of details, but I think the essence of it was produce books. And Fairbank, having done records, evaluated books very highly. And he tried to run the center in such a way that everybody had the responsibility for writing a book. Fairbank was a great editor, and he told people what to work on. If they expressed some interest, he would say, "Oh, that topic is no good," and then he suggested other topics they might work on. And he didn't live in the era when he had a lot of different interpretations. It was kind of a grand history that was all comprehensive and I think close to being the definitive study of something. That's the way he conceived history. And these books would fill a role in the history. One would be on the May 4th movement. One would be on the 1898 revolution. One would be on, the communist movement. So that each person would work on the study. And Fairbank was frankly an elitist person. He had the MA program, and the purpose of the MA program was not just to get ready, but all for advanced studies, but for Fairbank to select the people who wrote the best essays and let them in the PhD program. Then, once they were in the PhD program, he selected the best ones of those and allowed them to have a postdoc. Then the purpose of the postdoc was to write that book. And the thesis was already a good draft, but the postdoc was to allow them to have access to all kinds of materials, to overseas language, and to get that book out. And if you went into Fairbank's study in the later years, you saw a nice big bookshelf. East Asian Series number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, all the books in the series. And then the East Asian monographs, all the books in the series. That was a centerpiece to me of Fairbank's office, because that was the product of scholarly work. Could be best judged by the work. It could reach critics. It could reach greater audiences. And then after the basic research had been done, then you could also do popular work. And he, although Fairbank was an elitist, he accepted the responsibility for writing books for the general public. So China and the United States for him, and Reischauer, United States and China, United States and Japan, those were sort of the basic building blocks. And they influenced me because later when I was thinking about Japan, I was trying to think, I was working, of course, both on China and Japan. And in Japan, I wanted to write a book as Japan was on the rise and give a broader audience to the public. It was very much in the spirit of Fairbank, which is, you've done the basic research, you've done your monographs, now write something that reaches a broader audience and affects the public. And so that was a part of the role of what the Fairbank Center did. And he was not only for the best Harvard students, he wanted to capture the best young people around the world. So when there was a Korean senior scholar he invited, and the purpose of inviting that Korean senior scholar was so he could help select the young people in Korea who could write books that could come to the Fairbank Center. And he wanted to give him honors so he would cooperate. But the real goal was to get that young person who had written a good monograph doing the great research. And so Lucien Bianco came from France, and Harold Schifrin, I think, had already gone to Israel at that time. Kim Jun-yap came from Korea. And so he wanted the very best talent, the young people. They would spend a year and become a part of that small elite group. Then that small elite group would have a community where they saw each other, and a very important part of that, of course, was a lunchroom. Now, the first Fairbank Center was Dunster Street, part of what's now, I guess, called the Smith something or other. In my days, it was Holyoke Center, but in those days, it was Dunster Street. And it was a grand old building with a big courtyard, and it had been used in the Gilded Age, and there were some rooms that still had bathtubs in them, which was a storage place for certain kinds of materials. And the important thing about the center, they were all around a courtyard, so David Roy and Hal Kahn and Mark Mankel and I would see each other every day. In those days, staff work was not so complicated. There was one staff person, and the center did not look like an office complex. It was a small home for a few scholars who saw each other. And then there was the lunchroom. And Fairbank was so busy administering and seeing over things that he didn't come to lunch every day. But the lunchroom was dominated by the sage of our group, who was Ben Schwartz. And Ben Schwartz was interested in all kinds of topics. And he was known to many of us as, on the one hand, on the other hand. I mean, those of you who were Jewish or know the Jewish background know the Talmud. You have two interpretations, if possible, of all the basic texts. Schwartz used somewhat the same approach in approaching Chinese texts, and he always was full of ideas. and always had some kind of profound insights, which he'd put modestly. But we talked about all kinds of things. But Chinese studies and what the fate of China was always very central. So people of different administrations, different background, we all talked about what happened in China. So this was the Fairbank era up until the time when I came. They had maybe one more thing I should say about it, and that is that Fairbank's belief was that the crowning discipline, of course, is history and grand history. But he recognized that social science was considered important and that somebody ought to work on it. And the post-49, somebody ought to work on it. It was not something which he had intense personal stomach for, you know. By the way, when Fairbank and Wilma first came out of China in 1972, their first visit since they left in the 40s, I was in Hong Kong to receive them and host them around Hong Kong. I was doing some field work there for a year, and so spent all the time with them while they're in Hong Kong. And the dominant view that came was a sadness of all the sounds that Marion Schlesinger was talking about. And Wilma was so unhappy about the gates of the forbidden city being torn down and lost all of that. They were not intensely impressed by what they considered kind of a rigid framework of the city that they saw. Fairbank was sometimes kind of flipped the way he talked about things. Well, maybe the communist period is in the tradition of the empire. And, you know, he would throw out flip comments like that occasionally, but he didn't really get into serious research on the post-49 period. So in the early 60s, he wanted to get into modern studies, and he realized that disciplines would be the way to break into it at Harvard and get people from political science, sociology, anthropology, and get somebody at the law school and hopefully even at the business school to attract some young people. And at that time, the foundations, because of the McCarthy period, they were afraid to support the center. So the best way we could get any funds was the U.S. government, because of the Cold War, was willing to give, through the Air Force, some research money. They gave it to the Russian Research Center, and then they gave it to the Fairbank Center. And he brought John Lindbeck, who worked in the government in Washington, here to lead that program, to make sure we got the money and to attract young people like Ellis Jaffe and Roy Hoffheinz and Dwight Perkins and myself, who would begin to work in the various disciplines as a way to spread out. This was in the 1960s. And when I took over the center in 67, in a way that could be seen as, I had just gotten tenure, and I was in the sociology department, Dwight Perkins was in the economics department, Jerry Cohen was at the law school, and we were all kind of to branch out Chinese studies and begin to develop it. And although history would be kind of the main core, we would branch out in these various fields. In 1967, when I took over the center, by that, I should back up one sentence. In the early 1960s, we suddenly got funding. Why was that? Because the McCarthy period had ended, and the Ford Foundations were no longer afraid to give money for Chinese studies. And it was so clear that China was not going to disappear, as some people thought in the early 1950s, or that Taiwan would invade China, and that we had to come to terms with this place and really learn about it. So the foundations were timid about taking on Red China in the 1950s, but by the end of the 50s, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Mellon, all realized they had to work on it. And by that time, the McCarthy mood had passed, and it was all right to. So they endowed and supported the program to get started in expanding to contemporary studies. So in 1967, when I took over, already by that time, they were beginning to feel that they had watered the plants and that they could go water some new plants, particularly after 72. When people wanted to start going to China, they said, why should they waste their money on the centers, which they already got started? They would send people to China to do research on China. So the foundations were not as generous, and in the mid-1970s, they began to slow down. So is I look what happened to the Fairbank Center when it split off. Why do it used to be the East Asia Center. Why East Asia? Fairbank's concept of East Asia was East Asia culture. So it was people who used Chinese characters, who knew Chinese Chinese Confucian classics, and who used chopsticks. Some people have short. So that was his concept of East Asia. It's quite different from now, where we think of security issues, and we may think of China, Japan, Korea, maybe Southeast Asia as part of the East Asia sphere. To his view, Korea belonged in, Japan, China, and part of Vietnam because it had a Chinese heritage of those characters. So it was that concept of the Chinese cultural heritage that was East Asia. So when I took over in 1967, it was to sort of expand in the social sciences. By that time, when Fairbank retired, but he created, like a retired emperor, there was a new organization called East Asia Council, and that was for fundraising. The idea was to try to, at that point, raise endowment to continue the center. It was a little early, and it was not overly successful. It's not because Fairbank didn't try. It's not because he didn't put a lot of resources. Essentially, the East Asia Council was like having Harvard's development office inside our center location. There was a guy named Bill Olney who took a huge salary and didn't get us any money. There were some other people. He had quite a large staff. The Fairbank, I had one secretary, and I think Fairbank maybe had 3 or 4 assistants at the council. But my job was to try to develop the social sciences and the various disciplines. And so at that time, I realized that we were not going to get many new funds, and it was also a new situation. That is, we had begun to produce graduates in various places, and therefore there were more people around the community, and that we needed to do more. For example, one thing I started was the inter-university seminar. So the people in the Boston area or within automobile distance of Boston could come together once a month on issues to keep them intellectually alive. And it started certain conferences, for example, on Chinese literature, Republican China, where, because there were more people in the field, so at the very beginning, in the early Fairbanks Center days, that wasn't necessary. We didn't have that many people, but it was something to work on. The other thing I tried to do was expand the library on contemporary China so that people doing research, and we were still doing it from the outside, could have access to materials. So I went to Y.T. Feng, who was, by the way, a very good friend of Fairbanks, and later became the head of the whole Harvard Library, a Chinese woman who was very able person. And I had her do a study of what we should do. And she said, well, you should collect all the ephemeral things because there's so many things, all kinds of special materials, some kind of translation series, things that are not available, but are available to research people. And so I had the good luck of finding a good librarian. I advertised, and this one young lady came to us, and she was working at that time at MIT for a guy named Griffiths, and she had started studying Chinese. And so I asked Griffiths for a recommendation. He says, she's terrific, but I hope you don't take her away from us. Well, we did. That's Nancy Hurst. And she's been a pillar of our center ever since that time in supplying, not only helping all the scholars find materials, using contacts to get NABU materials and using all kinds of friendships to expand that kind of program. And so we've continued. In my second term, after I came back from the government, I don't think there were many new things. I felt as if my job was to keep the thing going, bring in people, promote programs, but I didn't feel anything new. Now, to end up, I know my colleagues are ready to start and wondering why I went on so long. What I see happening to the field is it's grown. We have so many new, it's wonderful, the linguistic skill that young people have, the breadth. There's all kinds of new technology, things you can do with the computer we couldn't do before. You can use statistical information of all kind. But I think the essence of what we had that still is good to emphasize, and I would like to see more of, and that is to bring the key people in various different fields together and think about China. And not necessarily in a formal conference, but informally where we get together and think about the big issues. As I see it, what's happening now is a lot of people, even in Washington, they've done specialized studies, but they don't get the big picture. And even in the State Department and White House, we don't have enough senior people who really see the big picture. And even the people in the think tanks in Washington don't always see that big picture. So I hope that we can still keep that intellectual breadth that we had in the days of the small little group that worked on China as a whole. Thank you so much.
I had asked my colleagues to speak for 10 to 12 minutes, but Ezra's covered 40 years, which means there's only 20 minutes left, so maybe you could cut your remarks down a little.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Rod. Okay. I thought that might be the answer. To the colleagues in the room, I will be preparing the list of the book I expect you to write over the next few days, and I'll distribute it, as apparently Fairbank did.
I wanted to just, I'm fascinated by a lot of what Ezra said. I just wanted to add a couple of things about John Fairbank as a manipulator and as a creator of the field. He was a really field builder. But he sometimes did unorthodox ways. He didn't just say, you should write on this. David Roy, whom Ezra's mentioned, who has just died, who did this wonderful translation of the Jinping Mei, he never was satisfied with his work. And he went off down to Princeton to teach, and he still hadn't finished. So Fairbank went down to visit him. And while he was in his office, he said, can I see the manuscript? And he said, yes, there it is. So Fairbank looked at it. Oh, very interesting. Can I have a cup of coffee? So David Roy went off to get him a coffee, and when he came back, Fairbank wasn't there, nor was the manuscript. But it was published. That was his book on Guomoro, if I remember correctly. The other determined thing about Fairbank was that Ben Schwartz, whom Ezra has also mentioned, who was a wonderful colleague and with whom I had the privilege of teaching with for a few semesters, Ben Schwartz wanted to be in Japan studies. He wanted to be in Japanese religion, if I remember correctly. I doubt if Ben could have remembered by that time. Because what happened was he wrote one paper for Fairbank on Chinese communism. Fairbank said, that's it, grabbed him, and the rest is history. Because he wrote that wonderful book, Chinese Communism and the Rise of Mao, which is what brought me here as an MA student, that book. Of course, when I came here, Harvard being Harvard, that first year I was here, Ben Schwartz was on a sabbatical in Japan. In those days, in those early days, I'm talking now in the early 50s, we were being taught to be China experts across the field. There was no specialization or anything like that. You were supposed to know everything about China, including how to order from a Chinese menu. And the spoken language, which is now so rightly, heavily emphasized, was barely taught. I think there was Mrs. Bien, who was mentioned earlier today, gave one course in spoken Chinese. That was it, because Fairbank, as a historian, wanted us to read and read and read. And so all the emphasis was on reading. But that era passed, that era of us all being individual China specialists on all aspects of China. That era passed with the opening of China, by which time I was about to come here. And for a time, the Fairbank Center had a new clientele, because with Patrick Maddox, who was the executive director at that time, myself, we ran 2 seminars, which were every year, both of which were very well subscribed to. Didn't make much money, but they were well subscribed to. We had a businessman seminar for people who were just going into business. And in China, our best advice was to get a Hong Kong businessman to hold your hand when you go in. And we had a journalist seminar. And I remember Catherine Graham, a friend of John Fairbank's, came up and spoke at one of those seminars. But that era also passed, because soon the businessmen were going there with or without their Hong Kong or Taiwanese partners, and the journalists were going there, and they were being based there, which they hadn't been in the past. Fox Butterfield was based there, I think, not till the late 70s. And he was the first New York Times correspondent there after the war. So the journalists stopped coming, businessmen stopped coming. We were superfluous to requirements. And what we've been doing since has been focusing on our own research, our own studies. And I could see that Michael was right to ask us, what is it that the center might do in this age when we're all so divided? As I think he said, or someone said earlier on, every school in this university, and every school in most universities of comparable nature, has got people who are working on China. I think particularly at Harvard, the School of Public Health, but the business school, the law school, they all have people working on China. And we don't meet each other. We don't talk to each other because we're too busy talking to Chinese, not sharing our experiences. And I think one of my suggestions would be that there should be an in-house, let's say in-house Harvard, not in-house Fairbank Center, but run by the Fairbank Center. An in-house seminar might be one semester or two semester seminar, where a new development of wide interest might be looked at by a group of colleagues in various disciplines and from the professional schools as well. For instance, the end of the one-child family. The anthropologists and sociologists obviously take this very seriously. But obviously it affects the economy, it affects politics, it affects all aspects of Chinese life. And I would be very open to sharing the insights of other people in other disciplines on this subject. It's a new subject, just coming into place. And we already know, apparently, that the women are not rushing to have more babies. They've already settled into a different kind of life. But I think that if we had an in-house seminar run by the Fairbank Center, bring in a colleague or two, not to produce a great book, but just to inform ourselves. Perhaps a paper might come out of it, but to inform ourselves of what is happening. Secondly, it seems to me that one thing that we haven't done, as the China field has got so broad and so many people in so many areas of life take part in it, we haven't brought those people to Harvard in enough numbers, and certainly not to the Fairbank Center, to learn how they work in their area. I remember going to China with the British Secretary for Health and Social Services and being under the guidance for the first time, not of the foreign ministry, but of the health bureaucracy. It was a totally different experience. And you know, these bureaucracies operate very differently. There are one Chinese bureaucracy, and they all listen to Xi Jinping, of course, but they operate differently. They have done for decades. And I think that I would suggest, Michael, that one thing we might try and raise some money from, I don't mean pull the collection box around here, would be what I would call an outsider in residence. That it might be for a year, it might be for 6 months, depending on how much time they could spare. It could be a businessman, it could be a journalist, it could be an NGO person, it could be all sorts of people, and in some cases, the companies, if it was a businessman, might pay for them. We wouldn't have to pay, but we would get the benefit of their experience from their dealing with businessmen in China. One of the most important things is, however, it seems to me, is the issue of China faculty here. What Ezra didn't emphasize enough, I think, though he alluded to it, is that when John Fairbank decided that the social sciences were important, I think he thought that it wasn't sort of offhand decision. He really did think the social sciences were important. He went and raised the money for the chair that Ezra occupied, and he raised the money for the chair that Dwight Perkins occupied in economics. And that's still a matter of dispute with the dean's office, I gather. Who owns that money? And the job of the director of the Fairbank Center, I should remind you, Michael, is to look to the interests of the whole China field. I think that what is needed for us to do is an informal research, which can be done by our very talented staff. They've been so exhausted in the last 2 days, they'll have a little rest doing this, is to actually find out if we really are the premier center. Now, we obviously are in terms of quality. That goes without saying. This is Harvard. But Liz Perry tells me there are more people doing political science on China at Berkeley than there are at Harvard. And I think it would be worth doing a survey of the main centers of China studies to see how we compare, because I am obsessed with the idea that there's no point in bringing Chinese students here to learn about China from us, because that's what they do. They were in my class on the Cultural Revolution because no one had taught them that in China. And I'm sure they're in the other classes on China, which they haven't learned about in China. There's no point in bringing all those students from China if we have got no one to teach them. So what we need, alongside the grants that are being given generously to fund students to come to China, is funding for more faculty. And I think that a survey done by us, presented perhaps to the Vice Provost for his consideration, as to whether or not we should be allowed to raise money for more faculty, I think would be not a bad idea. I think that the Fairbank Center has been a fantastic resource over the last 60 years. It really was preceded, in my mind, because that's why I came here, by the Regional Studies East Asia program, which was a creation of John Fairbank and Ed Reichar, both of whom were my teachers. I remember going when I was I think my second to last year at Oxford, to say to the China professor at Oxford, who had to be an American because his name was Homer Dubs. And Homer Dubs, who was a very distinguished China scholar, was busy working on his translation of the Han history. And as soon as he realized that I didn't want to be his student and therefore wouldn't disrupt his work, he became very affable. And he told me that I could go to Yale. They taught language there, and they taught language during the war for the armed services. But that Fairbank had just started this program, which covered language, but also the social sciences, history, and art as well, in fact, because there was someone who taught art. And that seemed ideal to me. And as Ezra said, it was the MA program was for Fairbank to decide whether or not anyone there wanted to be an academic. The person had to decide for themselves as well, of course, and whether they were good enough to be an academic. Because once they had been got by him, their path was secure. Because what happened in those days would be a college X, I won't name any names, would call up Fairbank and say, we think we have decided to have a China historian. I've got just the person for you. He's just about to graduate, first-class person, and a job would be had. I mean, this is literally true, that people got jobs in those days, even without the kind of enormous examination that discipline departments give today. That era has long passed. The era when someone could get a job and tenure without publishing their thesis. That era has gone. And Fairbank cannot be replaced. I remember when speaking at his obituary, his memorial service, I said that he was the last emperor. Why? Because there are now many empires. There are all these places throughout the United States where many of his students went and created new Fairbank Center type places, but none as good as a Fairbank Center, and keep it that way.
I had the privilege of serving as director of the Fairbank Center from 2002 till 2005. I suppose everybody thought when I was appointed that I could do no harm because Coolidge Hall was being torn down. A new center would be erected. For the time being, the Fairbank Center would be stored in Central Square on an upper floor. And yes, somebody had to take care of the shop. So yes, it could be a person from EALC. Not a historian, not a political scientist, not a contemporary China person, but a old-fashioned European sinologist. I've often wondered how often the old Fairbank turned over in his grave after my appointment. It's not that I did not try to become a modern China specialist.
Hear, hear.
When I studied, one of my minors was sociology. When I went to Japan, my first choice was rural sociology because I wanted to understand why China could feed its billion people and India could not. But I found sociology so boring that I transferred to literature. But when I went back to Holland, my first job was again in the modern China field, singing the praises of the educational reforms of the Cultural Revolution. I published an article on that subject together with John Gardner in a book by Stuart Schramm, Culture, Authority, and Political Participation in China, a book with one of the longest titles. But when I had done that for 1 year and a half, suddenly one day when I returned to school after the intermission, Professor Holzway, Anthony Holzway, the specialist in Han history and our chair, came up to me and said, "Look, the teacher of classical Chinese died over the weekend. Can you take over his classes?" And so you see there is a benefit in a good old-fashioned European sinological education because I could. And I said yes. And ever since then, I worked in pre-modern China without much of a specific training. I've tried more recently to make up for this lack of expertise in the contemporary China field, but I won't go into that. After all, the period at the Central Square I don't think was too bad. This was before the financial meltdown, so there was money galore. We had space more than ever, both for visitors, for postdocs, for the library over there. We didn't have to put books away. we could have a large number of postdocs, so in that sense there was a spirit of community there. We had more food in order to entice people to make the long way from Harvard Square to Central Square. We offered free lunches, and it worked. And we were able also to extend the activities. One of my initiatives was to come up with a seminar for religion in China, and at least it survived for a number of years after I stepped down. We had a number of major conferences, some which went widely over budget. I hope this does not happen to you. But, and of course, we had the preparations for the 50th anniversary, for which, on which occasion Ron Szulewski compiled a history of the Fairbank Center for the first 50 years. One of the things I had to do when I was director of the Fairbank Center was to explain to visiting scholars what the Fairbank Center was. Because I had many visitors who proposed research cooperation. And they, from their side, would put in 20 people. Could I put in 10 people for this amazing, wonderful project? And I had to explain to them that the Fairbank Center did not have its own research faculty. The members of the Fairbank Center are appointed in departments that are willing to appoint a China person. And the chair of the economy of China was mentioned a moment ago. I remember that a few years ago there was money to revive that chair, and in their unbridled arrogance, I can say, the Department of Economics turned down the offer to get a free chair. People in economics don't do regional studies. The data speak for themselves everywhere, and you don't need any specific regional expertise. But anyway, I learned that in Chinese, the Fairbank Center is a shuti jiko, an empty body, a shell. We bring together people from the different departments on common topics. And the idea in the past that all people in the China field would be interested in everything about China is, of course, long behind us. It's a number of topics that all went that way. Now, a lot has been said about the great John King Fairbank. I do not want to say any word that may belittle his importance, but it might be useful to recall that the Fairbank Center, or John King Fairbank, was not the only place in Harvard that was devoted to the study of China. When Fairbank was away in China, the Harvard Yenting Institute had started the study of East Asian Studies at Harvard, which developed eventually in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And they were going to about it in a grand way by bringing in the grand man of French sinology, Paul Pelliot. He apparently spent 1 year here and left in desperation, or perhaps because nobody understood his perfect French. But there has been for many years, during the heyday of Fairbank, there was a considerable rift between the Fairbank Center on the one hand and ELC on the other hand. And of course, the people at ELC did not recognize themselves in the opposition which seemed to exist on the other side, that placed the study of modern China versus the study of the old China, which emphasized the use of method, especially the social science methods, of course, here at Harvard, history calls itself a social science. Whoever had heard such a thing before I came to this place? But anyway, whereas the people who did the modern China studies had a method, the people in studying old China only had philology, a dirty word. And of course, the study of modern China was relevant, whereas the study of the past was totally bereft of any relevance whatsoever. Now, for anybody, for any historian of China, I think that is, perhaps this is a caricature, but this is a weird idea. I think there is hardly any nation where the elite is as much obsessed with the history of its own nation as in China. And for anybody who studies pre-modern China, you have to know what's happening in China, because otherwise you cannot make sense of the scholarship, sudden shifts, disappearance of topics, the emergence of topics. So basically the people are condemned, the study of pre-modern and modern China are condemned to each other. And I'm happy to say that even before I arrived here, that kind of opposition had largely disappeared. After all, everybody who studies China goes through the same kind of language classes, goes through the same language schools in China, deals with the same topics. The idea that there are very fixed dates where modern China begins and traditional China ends has been given up. We see nowadays, in a way, the continuous resurgence of the Chinese tradition in many ways. So all that is, that kind of dichotomy has fortunately disappeared. And I think also, for instance, that Liz Perry had worked hard to already, my predecessor as director, to do away with that thing. Now, what can the Fairbank Center do, behalve organizing this kind of wonderful gatherings and flying me in? I think that is a major function of the Harvard Center, which it should continue to uphold. But I do think that one of the great things has been the bringing in PhD students, one of the ways in which the Fairbank Center started, but in recent years, PhD students have been fellows at the Fairbank Center, and for PhD students, nothing is as stimulating as other PhD students who are working on the same thing. Postdocs. We all know how important it is to finish that damn book and get it published. And you need a postdoc position. Unfortunately, after the financial problems, the means have gone down, and so the number of postdocs has gone down, but I would hope that in the future that number can go up again. The Fairbank Center has supported publications as part of the, nowadays, of the Asia Center publication program, so that should continue, and it should indeed serve to distribute information widely to the public at large, through the outreach activities. Our current chair already has said that the slogan for the next 60 years will be spreading more and more spiritual pollution. And I think that is, the wording apart, that is a major issue. China has, of course, every right to present its own image to the world. If we don't believe our own government, why should we believe a different government? And so I think that we need to maintain the tradition of independent research based on, as much as possible, on the facts, and as much as possible as we can. We are not diplomats. There are other people who are diplomats and who can tell the Chinese that it's not so bad. I mean, it's only the Fairbank Center, people connected to the Fairbank Center who are saying that. Now, in order to be able to do so, it means we need the sources. And so I do think that the maintaining the Fairbank Center as the collective voice of China scholars should play a very important role in pushing the library, pushing its own library to collect the materials that are needed to do research. And the problem is there are way more materials than you ever can buy. I wrote my dissertation for a PhD student, happy years, when there were no new publications from China. From 66 till 78, there were basically no new publications. You could select your topic, come up with a bibliography, and do your research. You didn't have to worry. Now every morning we open China academic journals and we check, and we are afraid that there may be another 5 articles that have wiped away our ideas, taken away our ideas, and other things. The other thing is, so I do think that as a collective voice of the community, this is a very important role. There is a large amount of material that either disappears quickly, there's a large amount of gray materials, and if you want to do the kind of research I think we want to do, you have to do. And we have to continue to teach what we want to teach. I remember that a few years ago we had classes on June 4th at ELC, which were taught by Rowena He. In the first year, she had quite a number of students taking that course. In the second year, she taught that class. Suddenly, there was no Chinese students taking that course because they had been warned by patriotic friends that it was unpatriotic to take that class. I still think that one of the worst experiences I ever had at Harvard to realize that Harvard students were warned of taking classes they might want to take, because apparently there is an organization within Harvard which tells them not to do so. I don't think these patriotic students who warned other students of possible unpatriotic behavior acted on their own. So I do think that in these fields, Harvard has to stand on its own and show its backbone. As I am retired, I leave it to other people to show that backbone.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for giving me the chance to join this really illustrious lineup of former directors, and to say a little bit about some reflections on the Fairbank Center, my experience as director, and what the future might hold. So I've been listening. Some of these stories I've heard before, others I haven't heard before. We heard a story this morning, actually, from Ellen Widmer. About the Fairbank Center dances, which was news to me. I realized that I clearly missed a trick when I was director at the Fairbank Center. I could have reintroduced the dances, but you know. So just think about that.
Not going to happen.
Think about that. So, what's apart from the pleasure of reminiscing, which I enjoy as much as anybody. What is the point of our going over this history here at the Fairbank Center? It's appropriate that we do so, I think, at the 60th anniversary, 1jiazi, right? But what's the takeaway here? And I think part of the takeaway is that it reminds us, first of all, it reminds us of the mission of the center, which is to promote the understanding of China broadly in American society and in the world, including in China. look around the audience here. Again, this is a very different kind of a demographic than John Fairbank would have seen at any event, I think, run at the Fairbank Center during the time that he was the director. And one of the things that has really, I think, kept the Fairbank Center, continue to make it such an important place for research and for discussion about China has been the participation of scholars and students from all parts of the Chinese world who've come here to take advantage of the kinds of opportunities that exist here that may not necessarily exist in your home institutions. So that's one thing I think that these reminiscences, this review of the history brings back to us forcefully. Another is to remind us of, in fact, the advantages that we have today, the kinds of resources that are available to us in our library, in the different kinds of things that we can take for granted with postdoc programs and different kinds of fellowships and so forth, things that were put in place by either Professor Fairbank or by previous directors of the Fairbank Center. And it also reminds us, I think, to the importance and the value of thinking ambitiously about what such a place as this can do. There was not really a template for John Fairbank to follow when he set out to create a Center for East Asian Research in the mid-50s. What is now the Davis Center, the Center for Russian Research, had been established in 1948. The Middle East Center had only been around, I think, since 1953. These were brand new upstarts. Nobody really quite understood what they were capable of. It was really only the limit of the imaginations of those involved in these enterprises and the resources that they were able to bring to implement the things that they could imagine. That those were the only limits. There was a far thinner administrative level at Harvard in those days. You did not have a vice provost for international affairs. You didn't even have a provost. There was the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and that was about it. And the president, of course, of the university, who these presidents also actually did lend great support to the study of China, beginning with Charles Elliott, of course, in the 19th century, when the first teacher of Chinese came here from Ningbo in 1879, funded by Harvard alumni who worked in the Imperial Customs Maritime Service in Shanghai. So these connections go way back. I've been doing the vice provost job for a year. I hesitated a long time, as many of you will know. I talked to many of you before I said yes to this because I was director of the Fairbank Center. Why would I want to do anything else? For somebody who studies China, to be the director here at Fairbank, I mean, what more could you dream of? What better place, what better platform to help build the field that you've spent your life working in and that you want to see grow? And it was really in large measure because I knew that we have a deep bench of talent in China studies at Harvard, that I knew that even if I did step away from that there would be somebody else very capable to come in and do an even better job after me. Moving into this role then, this vice provost role, where I see what goes on at the School of Public Health and at the medical school and the law school and the design school and even the dental school. But some of you didn't even know Harvard had a dental school, because I didn't until I became vice provost. One thing I become aware of is that the virtue, the merit, the worth of having a center like the Fairbank Center or any of the area and international centers, the value of these places is not self-evident. It is not immediately intuited by everybody across the university and all the schools that, of course, we have to have a center for Chinese studies. And this is an important thing to have, and it should get all the resources it needs. It's obvious to us, like many of my colleagues, one of the main reasons I was so interested in coming to work at Harvard was because of the existence of the Fairbank Center, right? A legendary place, a mecca for anybody interested in the study of China in any period, really any discipline. But that is something that, although we're convinced of its truth, I think, and I take part of the responsibility for it. After all, I was director for 3 years, acting director for a year, and then director for a couple of years. We've not done probably as good a job as we should have or could have in getting the message out as to what it is exactly that the center contributes to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, or more broadly, to the university. And it's not because we don't contribute, but I think that we have assumed that it's obvious that we contribute. We're the Fairbank Center, after all. Do I need to say more? John Fairbank is super famous in China. You say you're from the Fairbank Center, everybody gets it. Well, of course, John Fairbank, 北京金，这么有名. Right? But John Fairbank is more famous in most parts of China than he is in many parts of Harvard. Right? So I think that going forward, one of the things to remind ourselves of is how to ensure that the Fairbank Center's mission remains relevant even here within Harvard, and that the story of what we do is told adequately and loudly enough. And this is a challenge, given the fact that the Cold War ended 20-something years ago now. The relevance of area studies has gone like that. And so that was the primary raison d'etre for ours and many of the other area centers as well. With that out of the way, why do we need an area studies center anymore? Right? Area studies is it's so yesterday. It's not relevant anymore. Then people in the Fairbank Center, it's a little bit of that same sort of hived off mentality of it's just a bunch of China people talking to each other all the time, and who can understand what they have to say to each other anyway. But of course, China has become mainstream. I mean, John Fairbank's ambition to make the study of China something that mattered to everybody, or that should matter to everybody in the university, self-evident to everybody in the university, has come true. As Ellen Widmer, again, I'll quote her today for the second time, said, she was doing her thing. She thought picking Chinese lit, this would be a nice, quiet little garden she could tend by herself and nobody would come and disturb her. And when I started Chinese studies, that was kind of the thing. We were a bunch of weirdos doing Chinese language at 8:30 in the morning every day of the week. I mean, you had to really be kind of have something wrong with you when you were in college, right? You're supposed to party, and anyway. Ellen said China happened. Right? She used this line, and then China happened. And indeed, China has happened. It is now everywhere. The days 20 years ago, you could count on maybe one headline a week or even one headline a month in the New York Times about China. Now there are 3 or 4 headlines a day in the New York Times about China. So China has happened. And the Fairbank Center, I think, is still in the process of figuring out what to do with that exactly. And I say this partly because of conversations I have had with people in China, including our own alumni who live and work in China. I was at dinner with one of them a few years ago, and he said to me at dinner, if you think that people in China look to Harvard for information about what to think or what to say about China, you're wrong. Harvard is not the conversation maker anymore when it comes to what should be said, what should be thought, what should be written about China. And this was first of all, I thought it was terribly rude. But it was a rude awakening for real, because it did seem to me that this was something that went without saying, and yet clearly, because China had happened and there were people with expertise around China, or claimed expertise at least around China, everywhere now, the voice of the Fairbank Center, which had been dominant, was no longer quite so dominant as it had been, really, in many, many fields. So how to go about reclaiming that, I think. This is something that I certainly thought about a lot when I was director, and I know that it's on Michael's mind, and I think it's on the mind of everybody here. It's not so much a question of the research. The research, I think, is as good as it has ever been. Faculty research, the kind of work that our graduate students do, the theses that our undergraduates produce, the fine work that we get from RSEA students, who continue to be a big source of PhD students. That has not changed. But I think where there is room for us to aspire to do even greater things has to do with bringing the national conversation about China back here and becoming involved in more different ways in it, if that's something that we aspire to. And I think that that's a basic question, really, that needs to be answered. If we do aspire to do that, then how might we go about it? We would, I think, want to follow the example set by Fairbank for a multidisciplinary and ideally an interdisciplinary approach to the study of China. But that means a lot more things now than it did in Fairbank's day. It involves atmospheric science, it involves public health, it involves business policy, it involves international law, it involves all kinds of things that have gradually sort of become part of the Fairbank Center's remit, but I think a more vigorous approach here is probably still something that we can try to pull off. And we could also think about maybe setting some agenda items where we would be leaders. Now, this came up in the environment panel. Zhang Ling mentioned the work that has been carried out here in the study of the environment, both in its scientific aspects as well as in its social science and humanistic aspects as well with regard to China. Environment in China could be something that the Fairbank Center decides that this is going to be us. We are going to brand, we're going to put the Harvard brand on this. I think digital humanities and social sciences, Digital China, which is on the very nice new app, the mobile app that I think James has probably put together, where Digital China is one of the things that you can click right there on your phone. I think this is another obvious area that we can move into. And I think also the discursive structures around China studies. We've been around enough at the Fairbank Center to have seen various kinds of iterations of how it is that the conversation around China itself happens. And to think about that, and to think about what it's like now and I'm repeating some of the things that I said yesterday morning, but when Weibo means that the conversation here can be happening in China at the same time and will show up in somebody's Weixin account and then will be on Twitter, and so forth, the opportunity here to be engaged in a single or at least a concatenated conversation in more or less real time, this is something that our predecessors couldn't really imagine. But I think it could be a very powerful tool for us to work more closely than ever together with colleagues in China, who are, after all, I think, the people, together with colleagues here, that we really need to keep in mind as we advance the study of this terribly important and also terribly interesting part of the world. And I'll stop there. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the four of you. As I had asked, all four of you spoke both about the past and about the future. It's enormously helpful to me. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We have to stop right on the dot of 4 because Ezra has to catch a plane. I think
typical Ezra.
I think given the nature of the conversation, what I'll do is solicit a few minutes of questions and comments and then turn back to the panel for comments, and then I'll make a few final remarks. I let every one of my speakers go over time.
Thank you.
因为长辈的关系. But anticipating what's coming, let me warn you, if your question is preceded by an anecdote, The anecdote has to last no more than a minute, or I'll cut you off. And I already see a couple of hands. Fred first.
Short question, or not a question. Fred Grant, I'm a Boston lawyer and associate in research. First off, I'd like to say thank you to the directors collectively, including the ones who are not here. I'd like to say thank you to the Fairbank Center staff and to all the people who participated in the panels. I'm sure this is a sentiment of the crowd. This has been an extraordinary 2 days. So I'd like to say thank you, not only for all you've done to make this such a memorable 2 days, but thanks to all of the directors and the future directors for putting together a tremendous and a tremendously useful program. Thank you.
Thank you.
When he was president of the university, Larry Summers asked me at a party, why did John Fairbank found the center? I didn't know because I'd never asked John that in many years. But it didn't matter because Summers had points on his mind. He was being pressured by Hispanic groups in the community to have equivalent of an area studies center. And he said to me, his objection to it was that he didn't see what the intellectual method would be. Well, he turned that down, and some other centers he said either yes or no to. But my question is whether the tension between the rigor of the disciplines and the area studies has reached a compromise, a satisfactory compromise. There have been hints on both sides of this question, and you can't say area studies is collapsing when you have journals like the China Journal, China Quarterly, the Journal of Asian Studies, most of which we would in this room think is worthwhile. But as the rigor, the invasion of the disciplines, has it got further to go, or have we reached some plateau?
To save time, I think my anecdote is the 30 seconds anecdote. I never thought I would ask for the floor this afternoon, but when I heard Professor Vogel speaking and Professor MacFarquhar, I thought about the past, and John King Fairbank was also very good at getting here people who had very mediocre grades and knew absolutely nothing about China, but they were coming to what problem in his eyes were unprivileged areas, or at least part of the world where nobody thought about coming to China, coming to Harvard. I'm talking about Italy in 1966. Okay, so he got me from Italy and took me here in spite of the fact that I had very mediocre grades. And for that, I'm very grateful, and later I become a diplomat. So my question, which is, is more than a question, it's a statement. I do hope that when you speak about having more meeting among professors of different disciplines, also about more meeting between professors from Europe and from the United States. Thank you.
Thanks. So I was just interested in what Professor Idema said about the June 4th class. And I read somewhere that in Australia, the Chinese government has an organization for when students arrive. They essentially help them find a house, and they set their whole life up in China, and then they have full control over what they do at the university. So the system of control of students is getting more and more pervasive. And I'm just wondering whether Harvard or any other university has a strategy to deal with this.
One last comment, and then we'll let Ezra run. It's 5 to me.
No, that's fast. That's slow.
Oh, okay. If I get you to hold on, the clock I'm looking at is slow apparently, and Ezra doesn't want to miss his plane. So Ezra's going to say goodbye. Just hold on one moment, please. Ezra's going to say goodbye, and then we'll have your question.
I apologize. I shouldn't have arranged it this way. But in answer to Ross's question, the relation between the discipline and the field, all the discipline, I think what's happened is that we're at a very difficult time, and we're going to have continued battle. But I think we need to make the case that the integrated view of a country as large as China, that involves its history, its environment, its relation to the world, requires overall sophistication of thinking about this as an integral place that is not answered by people doing just one quantitative study. I think we need to keep making that case, and I wish all of you all the best. Sorry, I have to rush. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ezra.
Thank you. Everybody said most of time they are spend most of time researching Chinese studies. But would you please tell me what maybe the Chinese culture influence your life or working? Thank you.
我刚才没听懂，抱歉啊。
Chinese culture maybe impact on your life or working.
Aha.
All right, one last question.
Benjamin Gallant, first-year PhD student. One of the questions that you raised was the need for funding, and I know some people in China discussing, Hanxue talk about how it's been related to the U.S. government, but also, as Professor Idema said, we don't trust our own government, so how can we trust the Chinese government? What kind of sources are there for funding when, businesses may not be better?
Do the three of you want to respond to? They were all very simple questions that require one-word answers. Do you want to try and make a quick response before we wrap up?
Yes, is that a good answer?
Good?
No. Just on Ross's question, disciplines and area studies, a lot of political scientists who are working on China are, because this is the way the discipline trains you, are perfectly familiar with the advanced techniques of the discipline as they are of any one year. What I did with students was to send them to my most sophisticated colleagues and make sure they took a course from them, put one of them on the dissertation committee. And I remember one of those colleagues saying, I said, what do you think of the dissertation? He said, I thought it was very good, but it didn't seem to use any modern methods. And that's, I think what has happened is that the people in the disciplines are beginning to realize that China is perhaps bigger than all of them. And if they don't believe that, what I try and arrange to do, and it requires a bit of money and ingenuity, I sent a couple of them to China. They found out.
Any comments in response?
Well, personally, I think that the old dichotomy between the discipline-based study of China and the more traditional sinological study of China, that it is largely a thing of the past. Everybody is convinced that for any, you need to nobody can be a comprehensive China specialist. Nobody aspires to be that. So you specialize in any specific field, and for that you need the discipline. Now, whether you come from a sinological background and start with the background and then realize you need a method, or you start from the method and become interested in China, you realize that China is not the United States, and so the whole rigmarole of election politics, statistics, is of no use. You will have to adapt to the local situation. So, and for the impact on our personal lives, I mean, we have spent all our waking hours studying China. It's, I suppose, becomes part of you, but on the other hand, we will never become Chinese.
A privilege and a curse.
Yes.
Mark.
I'll respond to the query on the Chinese student organization and the acculturation here, since nobody else has touched that. Only to say that when we learned about what had happened to this course, which came back and survived, and Chinese students began enrolling it again, so it does have a happy ending. And the book came out and was very well received and so forth. And the Fairbank Center supported that class and its activities in many ways, including everybody here. I think that the principle is that students are free to form whatever organizations they want. Now, this principle has lately come under some additional scrutiny and is being discussed further, but it's not the policy, certainly of the Fairbank Center or of any department or indeed of the university to investigate student organizations unless there is some suspicion of violation of laws in the United States. So, there are many different kinds of organizations, and students can choose to participate in them or not, or pay attention to them or not. Certainly, we're very well aware of the power that can be expressed through the some of the student organizations that Chinese students have, and other students from other parts of the world in the United States also may have. But the university is not in the business of policing those organizations at all. Those are matters that are, I think, have to be primarily left up to those organizations themselves. And if students feel that there are issues that the university needs to address, then they can bring them to the relevant deans and or professors or whoever, and situations can be addressed in that fashion. But it's ultimately both it's the risks and benefits in being in a society where there is freedom of association, freedom of speech, and all the rest of it. We're all familiar with, and that was a very unfortunate outcome. But ultimately, it was righted. The system did come through in the end.
I was facetious, of course, when I announced the new slogan for the Fairbank Center as being 60 years of spiritual pollution and still going strong. But there's a sense in which that's actually what the university is for. And one of the challenges I face, I think we all face in teaching our students, in particular now that many of our students come from the PRC, many are Chinese American, and many are not, is that we're actually responsible for all different kinds of spiritual pollution. Right? And by spiritual pollution, of course, I mean disrupting the existing ideas, introducing new ideas, encouraging students to think about the world in new ways. I think, I don't think Drew Faust would phrase it that way, but when you put it that way, spiritual pollution is what we do here. And I certainly think the Fairbank Center will continue to play that role and to support the work of colleagues and scholars who do that. As several people have pointed out, that raises interesting tensions in terms of our relations with other players in the game. That's one of the things that we need to think about. That again, Fairbank never probably had to think about. It's one of the new challenges we face.
I'm not sure, given the Vietnam War.
Yeah, given the, sorry, you're
I'm
right.
not sure that that's true.
Yeah, okay.
I would just add to this, if I may, a famous line from former University of California President Clark Kerr, talking about the university. And the role of the university, he said famously, is not to make ideas safe for students. The role of the university is to make students safe for ideas.
Very nice. That making China, making students. I think I may have to reframe the. Rod, you had a comment.
Well, now that what you've just been saying, I think that the new motto of the Fairbank Center should be spread spiritual pollution.
Yes.
Very good.
Indeed.
But what I wanted to comment on was the issue of students being told what to do by fellow students. Everyone here probably will remember that a few years ago, the President of China and General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, stated that officials should not send their children abroad to study. And his daughter was currently, I think, a sophomore here. She graduated.
Yes.
She did not withdraw.
I've learned many things today, which was my goal. One thing that I had really never even thought about was that the trend line for longevity at Harvard is definitely good. Professor Elliott mentioned President Elliott's support of Chinese studies at Harvard by bringing over Ge Kunhua in 1879. He lasted 2 semesters before succumbing to pneumonia?
No,
3
years.
3 years, okay. I will never forget now the image of Paul Pelliot fleeing in terror back to France. It's tremendously my good fortune and our good fortune that the trend line is much better. Ezra has been at Harvard for now more than 50 years. He told us the number. My math is just not good enough. It's been a tiring weekend. For more than 50 years. I'm enormously grateful to my colleagues for sharing their expertise and their wisdom. As I said, I was quite serious that I was hoping we could use that wisdom to think about our second sexagenary cycle. In some ways, I concur with Wilt's point. There's not so many ways in which the director of the Fairbank Center can get things wrong. We have such enormous name recognition in China. We have such an enormously rich library. We have such an enormously rich collection of scholars and colleagues and students. The Fairbank Center could continue in steady state, and we'd be doing just fine. But I'm inspired by your comments to address some of the new challenges, to think about some of the old challenges, and to strive to make the Fairbank Center not just one of the leading centers, but the leading center for Chinese studies in the world. It's perhaps, some may think it's perhaps inappropriate to end on this personal note. I have the best job in the world. And it's thanks to colleagues like you and all of you, and I hope that the job does have its challenges, and of course thanks to the extraordinary and wonderful staff who have worked so hard. So let me thank them again for their efforts. It's a job that has challenges, but they're exciting challenges. It's an exciting time to be dealing with the fact that China happened. And I look forward to continuing to deal with that with all of you in the years ahead. Thank you so much for your presentation.